She was 20 and homeless. No safety net, no family, no forward path, just a canvas duffel bag and a $10 bill she had earned sweeping floors in a bus station terminal. And with that $10, she bought a forgotten rotting saddle maker's shop deep in the Ozark Hills of Newton County, Arkansas, a place that had vanished from the county maps decades ago. The cedar roof had failed in 3 places, letting the freezing autumn rain rot the wide pine floorboards beneath. The limestone foundation blocks were settling unevenly into the damp earth, pitching the walls outward. The county had condemned it closed since 1917, demolition scheduled following the winter freeze. But what nobody knew was that beneath the wide floorboards, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over a century, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Darcy Slade had been searching for an anchor her whole life without knowing it. Her childhood was a blur of rented rooms and packing boxes. She learned early that permanence was an illusion, a luxury reserved for other people. The air in those temporary apartments always smelled of stale carpet and industrial cleaning supplies, a scent that meant they would not be staying long. She remembered the sound of packing tape ripping off the roll, the sharp, abrasive noise that signaled another upheaval. There were always strange ceilings to stare at in the dark water stains that looked like maps of countries she would never visit. She did not keep physical objects. Toys were left behind in the rush. Books were abandoned on windowsills. She carried her life in her memory, because memory did not require a suitcase, and memory did not weigh her down when the eviction notice appeared taped to the front door. Her mother was a ghost in her own life, a woman who seemed to occupy the space between the walls rather than the rooms themselves. She spent hours standing at narrow windows, watching the streetlights flicker on in whatever new town they had landed in. Her mother didn't yell. She didn't offer harsh words. Instead, she offered a profound, aching silence. She made thin soups and washed dishes with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion, staring past the suds into some distant horizon only she could see. Darcy would sit at the kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with her finger, listening to the drip of the faucet. The quiet in those kitchens was absolute. It was a silence made of unspoken apologies and sheer exhaustion. Her mother wore worn cotton dresses that hung loose on her frame, and her hands were always cold, smelling faintly of dish soap and old pennies. The only solid ground Darcy ever knew was her grandmother Ilara. Ilara lived in a small, draughty house on the edge of a timber line, a place where the air smelled of wood smoke and turning leaves. Ilara was a leatherworker, a quiet, methodical woman whose hands were stained the colour of raw walnut. Every weekend, when her mother needed the apartment empty, Darcy took a grey transit bus to the end of the line and walked a mile up a gravel shoulder to Ilara's door. The workshop was a converted sunroom. It smelled of neatsfoot oil, beeswax, and the rich earthen scent of oak-tanned hides. Ilara didn't talk much. She taught by demonstration. She showed Darcy how to hold a swivel knife, how to case the leather with a damp sponge until it was cool to the touch but not wet, how to burnish an edge with a piece of smooth canvas until it gleamed like polished glass. Those weekends were the only times Darcy's hands felt useful. They sat side by side at a sturdy oak workbench, the rhythmic tap of a rawhide mallet against a stamping tool echoing off the glass panes. Ilara taught her that leather was a living thing, that it remembered the cuts and the care you gave it. A good hide will outlast you. Darcy, Ilara told her one October afternoon, holding up a thick strap of harness leather to the window light, it takes whatever marks the world puts on it, and it holds them. It doesn't break if you condition it right. It just gets softer. It remembers. When Ilara died, the world went flat. Darcy was 17. The funeral was sparse, attended by a few neighbours and the local feed store owner. Her mother stood at the edge of the grave looking pale and distant. Within a week, the landlord cleared out the sunroom, the oak workbench, the racks of stamping tools, the rolls of tooling leather, the jars of antique finish. All of it was sold to a liquidator from 2 counties over to cover back rent. Darcy stood in the driveway and watched a white box truck carry away the only heritage she had ever known. She had managed to pocket a single item, a small block of pure beeswax Elara used for threading needles. She kept it in her coat pocket, rubbing it with her thumb until it was warm and smooth, holding on to the faint scent of the sunroom. The loss wasn't a sudden fracture. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, leaving her standing on an island of dirt that grew smaller with every passing tide. Her mother remarried a man named Thomas shortly after. Thomas was a man of nervous habits and sharp corners. He didn't raise his voice or lift his hands, but he dismantled space. He paced the narrow hallway of their new duplex, jingling a heavy ring of brass keys in his pocket. The sound became a metronome for Darcy's anxiety. He threw things away without asking. A sketchbook left on the counter would disappear into the trash bin. A sweater draped over a chair would be bundled off to a donation box. He liked the house sterile, devoid of evidence that people actually lived there. He watched TV with the volume muted, staring at the flashing images with a blank expression. He never looked Darcy in the eye. When he spoke to her, he addressed the wall just behind her shoulder. He made it clear, through 1,000 tiny bloodless actions, that she was a temporary guest in his structured, barren life. The breaking point arrived on her 20th birthday. The morning was bitter, the sky a bruised purple. Darcy had been working odd shifts at a diner, saving dollar bills in a coffee can under her bed. Thomas found the can. He didn't take the money. Instead, he placed the empty can on the kitchen island and stacked the crumpled bills next to it, precise and neat. When Darcy walked into the kitchen, her canvas duffel bag was sitting by the back door. Her sparse belongings were already packed inside. Thomas stood by the sink, jingling his keys. He looked at the wall behind her shoulder. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. There was no argument. He simply pointed to the bag and spoke 8 words. "You are an adult now. It is time." The next 6 weeks were a study in concrete and cold. Darcy slept in bus stations riding the line from Little Rock to Fort Smith, then up to Fayetteville. She learned the architecture of public spaces, which benches had armrests that prevented lying down, which bathroom stalls offered the most privacy to wash her face. The nights were a profound, bone-deep chill. She wore 2 sweaters and a denim jacket, wrapping her hands in spare socks. The money from the coffee can dwindled. $1 for a stale pastry. $2 for a cup of coffee to justify sitting in a booth for 3 hours. She learned to become invisible, to shrink herself down so the security guards wouldn't notice her in the corner of the terminal. The hum of the vending machines became her lullaby. The neon glow of the exit signs was her nightlight. The world felt enormous and entirely indifferent. On a rainy Tuesday in Fayetteville, she sought shelter in the public library. The air inside was warm and smelled of aging paper and floor wax. She sat at a wooden table in the back corner, near the local history section, pretending to read a newspaper left behind by a previous patron. Her eyes wandered to the back pages, to the legal notices and classifieds there. Buried under foreclosure announcements and zoning board minutes was a small smudged block of text. Newton County Delinquent Tax Sale, Property 4A, Jasper Limits, Abandoned Commercial Structure, Uninhabitable. Outstanding balance $10. The address was a rural route number. The description was bleak, but the words commercial structure caught her eye. It wasn't a vacant lot. There was a building with a roof, however failing, a place with walls. She reached into her pocket and touched the worn block of beeswax. She had exactly $12.40 left to her name. The bus ticket to Jasper would cost $2. She'd arrive with $10 and some change. It was a foolish calculation. She'd be trading a warm library for a condemned shack in the mountains as the winter frost approached, but the thought of another night under the glaring fluorescent lights of a bus terminal made her chest tighten. She didn't want to be invisible anymore. She wanted a door she could close. She folded the newspaper, slipped it into her duffel bag, and walked out into the cold drizzle, heading toward the transit center to catch the afternoon route south into the hills. The bus ride took 3 hours, winding down Highway 7 into the Ozark Mountains. The deciduous forests were a wall of dormant grey and brown, the oak and hickory trees stripped bare by the late October winds. The bus heater rattled, blowing dry, dusty air onto Darcy's shins. She watched the landscape shift from flat commercial sprawl to steep rocky ridges and plunging valleys. When the driver finally hissed the air brakes and stopped at a gravel pull-off outside Jasper, She stepped out into air that bit at her lungs. It was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. She hoisted her duffel bag over her shoulder and began the 2-mile walk toward town. The road was lined with dry weeds. She passed a sagging hay barn, its tin roof rusted to the color of dried blood, leaning precariously against a grove of bare walnuts. The temperature was dropping. The afternoon sky was the color of iron. Jasper was a small grid of streets anchored by a limestone courthouse. The town square was quiet. Darcy walked past a hardware store with galvanized buckets stacked in the window, a diner smelling of fried onions and strong coffee, a feed store with pallets of grain out front, a brick post office, and a darkened antique shop with a hand-painted sign swinging on rusty hinges. Pickup trucks were parked at odd angles along the curb. People moved with purpose, collars turned up against the wind. Nobody looked at her twice. She was just another traveller passing through. She pulled the folded newspaper from her pocket, checking the address for the county clerk's office, and turned toward the courthouse. The stone steps of the Newton County Courthouse were worn in the centre, hollowed out by generations of boots. She pulled open the heavy oak door. The interior was cavernous, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and a faint hint of peppermint. The hallway echoed with the sound of her canvas sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. She navigated past a bulletin board covered in faded zoning notices and 4-H club flyers until she found a frosted glass door stenciled with the words County Clerk. She turned the brass knob and pushed it open, stepping into a room lined with towering metal filing cabinets and dark wood desks. Behind the largest desk sat a woman in her late 50s. She had iron-grey hair pulled back into a tight bun and wore a thick cardigan draped over her shoulders. A pair of reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck. A wooden nameplate on her desk read Martha. Martha looked up from a stack of manila folders, her eyes assessing Darcy's worn jacket, the canvas duffel bag, and her pale, wind-chafed face. She didn't smile, but her expression wasn't unkind. It was the look of someone who dealt with paperwork and practicalities all day. "Can I help you?" Martha asked, her voice dry as autumn leaves. Darcy stepped forward, placing the folded newspaper on the desk and pointing to the small classified ad. "I'm here about this. The tax sale. Property 4A. Martha sighed, pulling the glasses up by the beaded chain and settling them on her nose. She squinted at the paper, then looked back at Darcy. "You understand that property is condemned, right? There is no plumbing. The electricity was cut off during the Eisenhower administration. The roof is mostly holes at this point." "Yes, ma'am," Darcy said. "It sits on a floodplain dip. The foundation is cracked. It's a tear-down. The county only put it up for $10, because that covers the filing fee to get it off our delinquent ledger." "I understand." "Yes, ma'am." Martha studied her for a long moment. She didn't ask where Darcy was going or where she came from. The Ozarks bred a specific kind of privacy. "You have the money." Darcy reached into her pocket, pulled out the crumpled $10 bill, and smoothed it flat on the desk. Martha slid a thick ledger across the wood surface, opening it to a page filled with neat, cursive entries. She produced a form in triplicate, carbon paper sandwiched between the sheets. Sign at the bottom. Print your name clearly. Darcy picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking slightly from the cold. She signed her name, Darcy Slade, and slid the paper back. Martha stamped it with a heavy brass stamp that landed with a satisfying, authoritative thud. She tore off the pink carbon copy and handed it over. Martha looked down at the signature. She paused. Her finger traced the ink. "Slade," she murmured. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Any relation to Elias Slade? Used to run cattle up near Mount Sherman, back in the 40s. Darcy gripped the strap of her bag. "I don't know. My grandmother was Ilara Slade." Martha's face softened just a fraction. The bureaucratic stiffness melted away. "Ilara, yes, she made the best bridle reins in 3 counters. My father bought a set from her in 1982. They outlasted the horse." Martha opened a desk drawer, took the $10 bill, and dropped it inside. She didn't ring it into a register. She pulled out a hand-drawn map on a piece of scrap paper. County Road 12. Go past the old iron bridge. Take the fork to the left. It's the board and batten structure set back in the trees. Door's probably swollen shut. You'll have to put your shoulder into it. Darcy took the map and the pink deed. Thank you. Winter comes early up there, Martha warned softly. Be smart. Darcy left the courthouse and walked east out of town. County Road 12 turned from asphalt to packed dirt and gravel within a mile. The road hugged a limestone bluff on one side and a rocky creek bed on the other. The water was low, chuckling over the stones. She passed scattered houses set far back from the road, wood smoke curling from their chimneys. A blue heeler dog trotted out to the edge of a porch, watched her pass, and gave one sharp bark before lying back down. The trees here were massive white oaks and towering tulip poplars, their trunks thick and resolute. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves still clinging to the lower branches. She walked for 40 minutes, following Martha's map, until she saw the fork. The building was barely visible from the road, hidden behind a thicket of dormant blackberry brambles. Darcy pushed her way through the brush. The structure was small, perhaps 20 by 30 feet. The board and batten siding had weathered to a pale silvery grey, the grain raised and textured by decades of rain and sun. The porch roof sagged dangerously, covered in rusted corrugated tin. Above the door, a painted wooden sign clung by a single nail. The letters were almost entirely faded, but she could just make out the ghost of the words, Custom Saddlery. The windows were opaque with grime, some cracked, others covered with spiderwebs thick as gauze. It looked less like a building and more like a natural outcropping of wood and shadow. She stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned in protest. She reached for the rusted iron doorknob, turned it, and pushed. The door was stuck fast, swollen into the frame. She remembered Martha's advice, braced her boots against the porch deck, and threw her shoulder against the wood. It gave way with a loud, tearing crack, swinging inward. She stepped inside. The air was trapped and still, carrying a scent so familiar it made her breath catch, a mixture of dry rot, old dust, and the unmistakable, lingering phantom smell of tanned leather and iron. The front room was empty, the floorboards wide and uneven. A counter spanned the middle, the wood scarred and gouged by sharp tools. She walked past the counter into the back room. The ceiling was low. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. In the corner sat a massive cast-iron wood stove, its pipe rusting where it met the chimney. There was no furniture, no debris, just the empty shell of a life's work. The cold was seeping through the walls. The sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long bruised shadows across the floor. Darcy didn't have a sleeping bag. She didn't have firewood. She found the driest corner of the back room, near the cold iron stove. She set her duffel bag down, using it as a pillow, and pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her coat tightly around herself. The wind began to howl outside, rattling the loose tin on the porch roof. The house creaked, settling around her. She lay in the dark, shivering, listening to the old timber groan. She traced the edge of the beeswax block in her pocket. She was freezing, hungry, and miles from anywhere, but the pink deed was folded in her pocket. She closed her eyes. Some things are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The first 3 days were a lesson in basic survival. The sun rose late over the Ozark ridges, casting a pale, weak light through the grime-caked windows. Darcy woke on the floor with her joints stiff and her breath plumbing in the freezing air. She didn't stay still for long. Movement was the only defense against the bone-deep chill. She found the water source out back, a hand-dug well lined with rough-hewn limestone blocks, covered by a rotted wooden lid. The cast-iron pulley was seized with rust. She spent 2 hours working it free with a rock and a splash of water, lowering the dented galvanized bucket down into the dark. The water she hauled up was painfully cold, so clear it held a faint blue tint, and it tasted of minerals and earth. 50 yards from the back door sat an outhouse, leaning precariously to the east inside. It smelled of ancient soil and dry oak leaves. She learned the physical language of the shop. She memorized the cadence of the wide pine floorboards. noting which planks groaned under her weight and which ones held firm. The building was speaking to her in a vocabulary of creaks and drafts, and she listened with care, charting the geography of her new existence. On the afternoon of the third day, she walked the 2 miles back down the dirt road into Jasper. She needed supplies. The air was dense with the promise of early frost. She found the local hardware store tucked behind the post office. It was a long, narrow building that smelled intensely of fertilizer sacks, machine oil, and raw pine lumber. The aisles were cramped, packed to the ceiling with galvanized nails, rolls of chicken wire, and axe handles. At the front counter stood a man in his late 60s. He wore thick denim overalls and a flannel shirt, his hands scarred and massive, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. His name tag read Harlan. He watched her approach with a neutral, assessing gaze. He didn't rush to speak. He wiped down the counter with a rag and waited. "Martha from the courthouse called me," Harlan said. His voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Said someone bought the old Saddlery out on County Road 12. Figured you'd be walking in here eventually. Building's been empty since the Great War." Darcy stopped at the counter. "I need some things, but I don't have much money yet." Harlan stopped wiping. He reached under the counter and pulled out a thick, green-bound ledger book. He opened it to a blank page near the back, wet the tip of a pencil, and wrote her name in block letters at the top. "Folks in this town pay their debts, you pay when you have it. That's the arrangement." He reached onto a shelf behind him and tossed a heavy, dust-covered book onto the counter. The cover was faded blue cloth. "My brother passed last spring. He was a carpenter, left a whole stack of manuals. He'd want that one used, not sitting on a shelf gathering dust. Take it." Darcy looked at the book. "Practical Carpentry and Home Repair, 1952. Thank you." She walked the aisles methodically, holding a scrap of paper. She tallied the exact amounts in her head. A stiff-bristled chimney brush was $14.50. A pair of thick leather work gloves cost $8.25. She found a bag of refractory mortar for $6.15, a box of Strike Anywhere matches for 89 cents, and 2 cans of baked beans that came to $1.40. The total was $31.19. She brought the items to the counter. Harlan wrote the figure in his green ledger. He didn't ask for a down payment. He didn't offer unasked advice. He bagged the items in thick brown paper, nodded once, and went back to organizing a bin of brass pipe fittings. She walked out into the fading afternoon light, carrying her debt and her supplies. Cleaning the chimney was her priority. The manual was specific about the dangers of a century-old flue. The next morning she climbed onto the sagging porch roof, gripping the rusted corrugated tin, and hoisted herself up to the main ridgeline. The wind up there was fierce, biting through her denim jacket. The view stretched out over the dormant Ozark Valley, a sea of grey and brown timber. She peered down the dark shaft of the brick chimney. The inner walls were coated in a thick layer of crystallized creosote, glossy and black, built up from decades of forgotten fires. She lowered the stiff brush into the flue, attaching sections of fiberglass rod, plunging it up and down. The sound was a harsh, scraping rhythm. Black soot billowed out of the top, coating her hands and her face. She worked for 3 solid hours. Her shoulders ached. Her fingers went numb inside the new leather gloves. The smell of bitter charcoal filled the air. She didn't stop until the brush moved freely without resistance. That evening she built her first fire. She crumpled a sheet of the newspaper that had brought her here, placing it beneath a lattice of dry hickory twigs she had gathered from the yard. She struck a match. The flame caught the paper, flaring bright orange in the dim room. The draught pulled strong and true up the newly cleaned chimney. The twigs popped and crackled, catching fire, and she added larger pieces of split oak. The cast-iron stove began to radiate heat, a beautiful steady warmth that pushed the cold back into the corners of the room. She opened a can of beans, set it directly on the flat top of the stove, and watched the liquid bubble. She ate straight from the tin with a pocket knife. The meal was simple, but it felt like a feast. The firelight danced across the wide floorboards. For the first time in her life, she was warm in a room that belonged to her. The next day she began a methodical inventory of the workroom. The space was 20 feet wide by 15 feet deep. The floorboards were massive, some measuring 16 inches across, cut from old-growth pine. A long, sturdy counter divided the front of the shop from the back work area. She walked the perimeter, running her hands over the gouged wood of the counter. She could see where a heavy vise had been mounted, the circular impression pressed deep into the grain. She could see the faint, dark stains of dye and neat's foot oil that had seeped into the wood over decades. She swept the floor at a measured pace. Using a broom made of bundled twigs, she cleared away a century of dust, spiderwebs, and dried leaves. Near the baseboard she found a single, tarnished brass rivet wedged into a crack. She picked it up, rolling it between her fingers. The room felt suspended in time. It was a space designed for labor, a room that expected the sound of mallets and the smell of raw hide. It felt empty, but it didn't feel dead. The anomaly revealed itself on Tuesday afternoon. Darcy was sweeping the far corner, near the east window. She tapped the butt of the broom handle against the floor to dislodge a clump of dirt. The sound was a dull, solid thud. She moved the broom a foot to the left and tapped again. The sound changed. It was higher, hollow, resonating with a faint echo. She stopped. She knelt on the floor, pressing her palm against the pine boards. The wood felt identical to the surrounding planks. She tapped with her knuckles. Solid, hollow. She examined the surface with care, bringing her face close to the floor. The seams between the boards were tight, packed with hardened grime, but running her fingernail along the grain of the hollow board, she found a subtle circular disruption. It was a flush-mounted cedar plug, no larger than a silver dollar, grain matched to the pine so perfectly it was almost invisible. She opened her pocket knife. She slid the thin blade into the microscopic gap around the cedar plug and levered it upward. The plug popped out, revealing a recessed cavity. Inside the cavity was a rusted iron ring pull. Darcy hooked her finger through the ring and pulled. The floorboard didn't budge. She braced her boots on the adjacent planks, gripped the ring with both hands and pulled with all her strength. With a loud, grinding screech of wood against wood, a section of the floor lifted. It wasn't a single board, but a constructed hatch spanning 3 floor joists mounted on hidden iron hinges. She folded the hatch back. Beneath it was a dark, dry compartment lined with zinc to keep out moisture and mice. She stared into the recess. Her heart was beating a rapid, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She reached down into the darkness. Her hands touched thick, oiled canvas. She pulled out the first package. It was weighty, wrapped in layers of protective cloth and bound with tarred twine. She cut the twine. Inside, nested in a custom-stitched leather tool roll, were the instruments of a master saddle maker. The tools were immaculate. The carbon steel blades of the French skivers were coated in a thin layer of protective grease, showing no rust. The hardwood handles of the edge bevelers, turned from dense, dark cocobolo wood, were smooth and polished from years of use. There were rawhide mauls with brass collars, steel groovers, awls with diamond-shaped blades, and an array of intricate stamping tools. It was a fortune in specialized equipment. Preserved in pristine condition, she reached back into the compartment. The second package was lighter. She unwrapped it to reveal raw material. There were tightly wound spools of premium linen thread, cakes of pure, unrendered beeswax, and a small roll of exquisite shell cordovan leather, its surface glassy and flawless, smelling rich and earthy despite the passing of a century. She laid the materials next to the tools, her hands shaking slightly. This wasn't just a collection of items, it was a complete functional workshop dismantled and hidden away. At the very bottom of the zinc-lined compartment sat a rectangular tin box. The metal was dull and grey, closed with a simple brass latch. She lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. She brought the box to the counter, setting it down under the weak sunlight falling through the window. She unhooked the latch and pushed the lid open. Inside, resting on top of a folded piece of thick parchment paper, was a canvas bank pouch. She opened the pouch and tipped the contents onto the counter. A cascade of metal spilled across the wood. They were coins, gold and silver. She sorted them with trembling fingers. There were heavy Morgan silver dollars dating from the 1880s and 90s. Their eagles stamped bold and sharp. There were $10 gold eagles, gleaming with a warm buttery luster. She counted them out, stacking them in neat columns. There were Indian head pennies and Liberty head nickels. The final count was $412.83. It was an odd specific amount, the exact contents of a cash register emptied on a final day of business. Beneath the coins, resting at the bottom of the pouch, was a military medal attached to a frayed ribbon of blue and yellow. The bronze planchet was stamped with the words Philippine Campaign 1898. It was a Spanish-American War Service medal. Darcy looked at the folded parchment paper sitting in the bottom of the tin box. The paper was yellowed at the edges, stiff with age. She knew what it was. She knew that reading it would change the geometry of her life, tying her to this room, to these tools, to the history buried under the floorboards. She wasn't ready. The revelation was too large for the small, cold room. She closed the tin box, leaving the letter unread. She walked out the back door into the freezing night. The sky was an expanse of shattered glass, the stars brilliant and cold over the Ozarks. The wind rustled the bare branches of the hickory trees. She walked down to the edge of the creek. The water was running dark and fast over the limestone bed. She sat on a boulder, pulling her coat tight. She watched the current, letting the sound wash over her. She thought about her mother's silent kitchens. She thought about Thomas's sterile hallways. She thought about the endless fluorescent nights in the bus terminals. She had spent her life shrinking, trying to take up as little space as possible. But the house behind her held a different kind of gravity. It had concealed its heart, keeping it safe through storms and rot, waiting for someone willing to tear away the rot to find it. She stayed by the water for hours, waiting for daylight. Some things are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. Morning arrived with a frost that coated the world in white. The weeds along the driveway were frozen solid, snapping like glass when Darcy walked back to the shop. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers. She added 2 logs of split oak, watching the bark catch and flare. She brewed a cup of black coffee in a dented tin pot, wrapping her cold hands around the mug for warmth. She walked over to the counter. The tin box sat exactly where she had left it. The morning light struck the dull metal, highlighting the scratches on its surface. She set her coffee down. She opened the lid and lifted out the folded parchment. The paper was thick, textured with cotton fibers. The ink was a faded sepia brown, written in an elegant flowing script that commanded attention. She unfolded the letter. "My dear one, whoever you are. The doctor in Fort Smith tells me my lungs are failing. A condition of the dust, he says, a hazard of breathing the fine leather particulate and the ash of the stoves for 50 years. He gives me until the spring thaw. I do not fear the ending of things, I fear the forgetting of things. I sit at this bench today, looking at the tools my hands know better than they know my own face, and I cannot bear the thought of them being sold for scrap iron or scattered to strangers who do not know their weight. Our blood is tied to this craft. My grandfather Silas brought these skivers over the mountains from Virginia in 1842. He was a hard man, quiet as stone, but he could read a hide like a preacher reads a Bible. He taught my father Jedediah, who built this shop in 1870, raising these walls with timber he felled himself. And my father taught me, I'm Eudora. I took over the benches when the typhoid took my father in 86. We were makers of utility. We made the harness that pulled the ploughs. We made the saddles that carried the mail. We bound the physical world together with thread and hide. I closed the shop today, October the 14th, 1917. I locked the front door and I will not open it again. The world is changing. The motor cars are rattling down the valley roads, smelling of gasoline and noise. They do not need our leather. The town looks at me as a relic, a woman practicing a dead trade in a dying building. Let them look. But the true silence fell upon this house years ago. I had a son, his name was Arthur. He had my grandfather's quiet nature and my father's steady hands. He was supposed to take the bench. He was supposed to learn the rhythm of the maul. But the government called and the war sounded loud in his young ears. He went to Cuba. He died on the slopes of San Juan Hill on the 1st of July, 1898. They sent me a telegram and a bronze medal. I put the medal in this box. I did not weep in public. I came back to this room and I worked the leather until my hands bled, trying to stitch my grief into the saddles. But grief cannot be contained in a seam. If you are reading this, the house has stood. If you have found this compartment, you possess the curiosity and the patience required for the work. I leave you these tools. They are not merely metal and wood, they are an extension of the mind. When you use the edge beveler, hold it at a strict 45-degree angle. Let the tool do the work, do not force it. When you case your leather, use rainwater, never well water, the minerals will stain the hide. When mixing your edge coat, use 3 parts pure beeswax to 1 part rendered mutton tallow, melted over a low flame, never boiling. The leather must be respected. It was a living thing once, and it will live again in your hands if you treat it with honor. I do not know your name. I do not know what roads brought you to this rotting floor, but I know that the things we build outlast the sorrow we carry. I know that a good tool wants to be used. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eudora Slade, November 4th, 1917. Darcy read the letter twice. The silence in the room was absolute. The words resonated in her chest, filling a hollow space she had carried since her grandmother Elara died. Eudora Slade. This was her blood. This was the source of Elara's quiet, methodical nature, the origin of the beeswax block she carried in her pocket. She traced the signature with her fingertip. The ink was dry and flat, but the intent behind it felt vibrant and alive. The letter was a bridge across a century of silence. It was an inheritance freely given, bypassing the neglect of her mother and the sterile cruelty of Thomas. She folded the parchment along its original creases with care, placing it back into the tin box. She walked out the back door, leaving the shop behind. The letter mentioned the building was raised in 1870. She walked the perimeter of the foundation, studying the massive limestone blocks. She moved past the well, toward a grove of ancient white oaks at the edge of the property line. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled. She walked among them, searching. The letter had spoken of Arthur, of grief stitched into seams. On the largest oak facing the creek, she found a scar. The bark had grown around it, trying to heal, but the original cut remained. It was a simple cross, carved deep into the heartwood, and below it, barely legible after a century of weather, was the letter A. This was the physical marker of Eudora's quiet mourning. Darcy reached out, pressing her palm against the rough bark. The wood was cold, enduring. She returned to the shop as the afternoon light began to fade. The interior was dropping in temperature. She went to the cache of materials she had pulled from the floor. She unrolled the protective canvas. Among the tools, she found a small brass oil lamp, its reservoir still containing a shallow pool of kerosene. She trimmed the cotton wick with her pocket knife, struck a match, and touched the flame to the fibre. It caught instantly. The lamp threw a warm, golden circle of light across the scarred wooden counter. She watched the flame. It burned steady and true, without flickering. It was a small light, but it held back the encroaching dark. She sat on the floor by the wood stove, watching the lamp. She thought about the chain of small, profound kindnesses that had delivered her to this moment. She thought about the bus station janitor in Fayetteville who had looked the other way when she slept in the corner booth. She thought about Martha at the courthouse, securing the pink deed and offering the hand-drawn map. She thought about Harlan at the hardware store, handing over a manual meant for a dead brother and a line of credit built on nothing but trust. These strangers had constructed a fragile bridge for her to walk across, unknowingly guiding her back to a room that held her own name. These stories are often built on the assumption that we rescue abandoned spaces. But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that sometimes the walls we rebuild are the very things that give us shelter from the storms of our own lives. If you have ever found comfort in the quiet repair of a broken thing, or if a stranger's small grace has ever changed your trajectory, leave a comment down below. It helps to know we are not doing this work in a vacuum. The fire in the stove crackled, settling into a steady burn. The shop was warm. Darcy unrolled the canvas tool bundle on the floor beside her makeshift bed. She didn't want the tools sitting on the counter. She wanted them close. She lay down on her canvas duffel bag, pulling her coat over her shoulders. The brass oil lamp burned low on the floorboards, casting long shadows of the skivers and mauls against the board and batten walls. She closed her eyes. The house creaked in the winter wind, a slow, familiar settling. It was the sound of a building that had stopped waiting. She slept soundly, without dreaming. December the 12th brought the first severe test of the structure. A system of freezing rain swept down from the Missouri border, coating the Ozark timber in a shell of dense ice. The old cedar roof failed under the weight. Water dripped onto the wide pine floorboards in a steady, maddening rhythm, pooling near the wood stove. Darcy sat by the brass oil lamp and read Chapter 4 of the Carpentry Manual 3 times. She calculated the materials required with meticulous focus, writing the numbers in the margins. She needed 18-inch No. 1 grade hand-split cedar shingles. 4 squares would cover the surface, plus an additional 10% allowance for waste, totaling roughly 990 shingles. She needed 30-pound asphalt felt to line the decking, a 25-pound box of 4-penny galvanized hot-dipped roofing nails, a roll of malleable lead ridge cap, and 8 lengths of 2x6 spruce for sister rafters. The next morning she walked into Jasper through the sleet, presenting her calculations to Harlan at the hardware store on the back of a torn brown paper grocery bag. Harlan studied the numbers, grunted his approval, and added the cost to the green ledger. Before she left, he reached under the counter and handed her a broad-headed shingling hatchet with a stacked leather grip. "Belonged to my brother," he said. The following day, an older man named Emmett arrived at the property in a battered pickup truck. He was a retired commercial roofer with a face weathered like tanned hide. He refused any payment, claiming he needed a reason to get out of the house and that Social Security pays for my coffee. For 11 days they worked in the biting cold, starting at 7 in the morning. Emmett taught her the mechanics of the trade. They reinforced the failing roof structure from the inside first, bolting the 2x6 spruce sister rafters alongside the rotting originals with 3 heavy carriage bolts driven from the underside up. Outside, they snapped a blue chalk line exactly 7 inches below the eave to create a proper 1.5-inch drip overhang. "Stagger the joints 1.5 inches on every course," Emmett instructed, his breath pluming in the frost. He demonstrated the 3-stroke nail technique. Set the tip, drive the shaft, sink the head flush without bruising the wood. Emmett was a man of strict standards. "That nail's proud," he would point with a gloved finger. "Pull it, or, course is crooked, reset the line." By mid-December, the last lead ridge cap was nailed into place and shaped over the peak. The freezing rain returned that night, but Darcy slept in dry silence. The makeshift tarp was gone, the roof held firm. The bitter cold of January exposed the weaknesses in the masonry. The west face of the chimney, battered by decades of prevailing winds, was failing. The mortar had deteriorated into a fine pale powder that sifted onto the roof, and several of the bricks were spalling, their fired faces flaking away. The Carpentry Manual contained a specific section on historic masonry repair. Darcy learned that using modern Portland cement would destroy the soft 19th century bricks because it was too rigid to allow for thermal expansion. She needed a specialized mix. For the exterior shaft, she mixed 1 part hydraulic lime to 2.5 parts sharp sand, hydrating it with collected rainwater in a plastic bucket. For the interior firebox, which bore the brutal brunt of the thermal shock, the formula changed: 1 part refractory fireclay, 3 parts sand, and just a small handful of cement for structural rigidity. The work took 3 weeks. The temperature hovered in the low 20s. She worked from a makeshift scaffold built of stacked timber and plywood. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes, forcing her to climb down and warm them over a small brush fire she kept burning in the yard. She chipped away the ruined joints with a cold chisel, brushed the dust free with a stiff wire brush, and pressed the new mortar deep into the gaps using a narrow pointing trowel. The repetitive motion was hypnotic. Mix, climb, scrape, point, freeze, thaw. She replaced 9 crumbling bricks with salvaged limestone blocks she found near the creek bed, matching the dimensions with her tape measure. In late January, the mortar was cured. She lit a test fire in the cast-iron stove. She stepped outside into the yard, her boots crunching on the frozen grass, and watched the chimney crown. The smoke rose in a tight vertical column, grey and clean against the pale winter sky. The draught was absolute. The hearth was secure, with the roof sealed and the fire drawing hot. Darcy turned her attention downward. The wide white pine floorboards were structurally sound, supported by massive oak joists, but they were buried under a century of ingrained dirt, spilled dyes, and crystallized sap. The boards measured between 14 and 20 inches wide, secured with hand-cut rose-head nails. She rented a heavy drum sander for $14 a day from an equipment supply yard in Harrison, catching a ride with the rural mail carrier to retrieve it. The machine was ponderous and loud, vibrating her arms up to the shoulders as she wrestled it across the room. She made 3 deliberate passes over the entire shop floor. She started with a coarse 80 grit paper to strip the black grime, moved to a 120 grit to level the raised ridges, and finished with a fine 220 grit to polish the grain smooth. The wood dust filled the air, smelling sweet, like an ancient forest warming in the sun. She applied 3 coats of pure tung oil, thinned 25% with mineral spirits, to allow for deep penetration into the dry wood. She let the floor cure for 48 hours between applications, walking only in her socks. The transformation was striking. The wood shifted from a dull, lifeless grey to a rich, dark honey, then to the colour of clover honey, and finally settled into a deep mahogany hue when the afternoon sunlight struck it. But the labour demanded a physical toll. On a Tuesday morning, she woke exhausted. Her hands were raw, the skin split at the knuckles from the mineral spirits. Her shoulders throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She made coffee but didn't walk to the tool corner. Instead, she put on her coat and walked down to the limestone creek. She sat on a frozen boulder, watching the water cut through the ice. A red-tailed hawk landed on a bare sycamore branch across the water, folding its wings with a rustle of feathers. It sat in absolute stillness, watching the current. Darcy watched the bird for an hour. She did not work that day. The house could wait. She needed to learn the rhythm of rest. The shop had 8 tall sash windows. 3 panes were missing entirely, replaced with rotting cardboard that offered no insulation. 4 windows were cracked, webbed with delicate fractures. Only 1 window retained its original rolled plate glass from the mid-19th century. A thick pane rippled with tiny, elongated bubbles. Darcy treated that single historic pane with reverence, washing it with diluted vinegar and a soft cloth, leaving its warped imperfections intact. She ordered 6 replacement panes through Harlan, cut to precise dimensions from standard float glass. Restoring the wooden sashes was a lesson in meticulous detail. She scraped away the petrified, crumbling putty with a stiff steel knife, working the blade to avoid gouging the wood. She removed the rusted glazier's points with needle-nose pliers and lifted out the damaged glass. She laid a thin strip of fresh DAP 33 glazing compound into the wooden channel, bedding the new glass firmly against it to create a weather-tight seal. She pressed new metal points into the wood frame with the flat edge of a chisel to hold the pane secure. Finally, she applied a smooth 45-degree bevel bead of putty around the perimeter, pressing it flat with a specialized glazing knife. The compound was sticky, smelling of linseed oil, and required a full 2-week cure before it could be painted. She replaced the rotted sash cords with fresh 1/4-inch braided cotton rope, tying a secure figure-8 knot at the cast-iron counterweights hidden inside the wall pockets. It was frustrating work that demanded a steady hand. On February 20th, she finished the final window on the east wall. As she stepped back to wipe her hands on a rag, a Carolina chickadee landed on the frozen blackberry branch just outside the newly clear glass. The bird tilted its head, looked inside the warm room, and flitted away. The barrier between the harsh Ozark winter and the sanctuary of the shop was finally complete. The interior walls were finished with horsehair plaster applied over hand-split oak lath, original to the building's construction. It had held up remarkably well over the decades, but chronic water damage from the failing roof had caused 3 significant patches to detach near the chimney. Each failed section was roughly 2 feet square, exposing the horizontal wooden strips beneath. Modern drywall compound would not bond correctly with the historic materials. It would crack and fall away within a year. Darcy asked Harlan for advice. He went into the dusty back room of the hardware store and emerged with a half-empty bag of dry lime mortar and a small tied bundle of coarse animal hair sourced from a local farmer. She mixed the materials in a plastic bucket with rainwater until they reached the consistency of thick oatmeal. Plastering required a specific, fluid motion she had to learn by trial and error. She applied the scratch coat first, pressing the mixture hard into the gaps between the lath to form keys that locked the material in place behind the wood. She scored the wet surface with her trowel to give the next layer a rough texture to grip. After a 72-hour cure, she applied the brown coat, bringing the surface flush to within 3/8 of an inch of the surrounding intact wall. The final finish coat was a smooth 1/8 inch skim of pure lime putty, troweled flat and misted with water until it felt like polished stone under her palm. She stood back, her arms speckled with white paste, breathing hard. She ran her hand over the repaired section. The transition from the old wall to the new patch was seamless. These patches will hold another 100 years, she thought, feeling a profound sense of permanence settle into her bones. Some things are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The isolation of the ridge was broken by the quiet, unobtrusive orbits of 3 people. Doris ran the diner on the square in jasper. She had tarnished copper hair pinned up in a messy twist, and wore modest silver jewellery that clinked when she walked. In early January, Darcy began finding folded brown paper bags left on the sagging front porch in the evenings. Inside were thick slices of meatloaf, foil-wrapped baked potatoes, wedges of dense cornbread, and occasionally a slice of cherry pie. Darcy confronted Doris at the diner during a quiet Tuesday afternoon shift. She tried to slide a handful of loose change across the counter. Doris pushed the coins back, her expression stern. "You need your strength to swing that hammer, skinny girl," Doris said, wiping down the commercial coffee machine with a damp rag. "You can pay me in leather belts when that shop reopens." Caleb was 17, the son of a dairy farmer down the valley. He had sandy blonde hair, hands the size of dinner plates, and rode a well-worn bicycle with a rusted chain guard. Every Saturday morning at 9:30, he rode up the dirt driveway, parked his bike against the massive oak tree, and began splitting the seasoned hickory logs Emmett had dropped off. He swung the heavy splitting maul with a rhythmic, effortless power, the sound echoing sharp against the ridge. After an hour, he would knock on the door, drink 1 cup of hot black tea standing on the porch, and leave. He wouldn't accept the dollar bills. Darcy tried to hand him on his 3rd Saturday. He paused with his hands on the handlebars. "My mother said," Caleb muttered, looking down at his scuffed boots, "about your great-grandmother. She knew her Eudora. She said your family was owed." He pedalled away down the gravel road before Darcy could reply. Reverend Boyd was a Methodist circuit preacher who lived 3 miles up the highway. He was a tall man in his 60s with a grey walrus moustache and a charcoal overcoat that flared in the winter wind. He walked past the Saddlery every morning on his daily constitutional. He never walked up the driveway. He never stopped to ask probing questions about her faith, her living situation, or her past. As he passed the property line, he would simply tip his felt hat toward the building and call out, "May the day be a kindly one." One frigid morning in late February, Darcy was standing near the front window, out of sight. She watched the Reverend approach. He paused at the edge of the road, looked directly at the smoke rising from the restored chimney, bowed his head slightly, and spoke exactly 4 words into the biting wind. "Lord, keep her steady." Then he tipped his hat to the empty yard and kept walking. Beneath the back half of the saddlery was a shallow root cellar, accessed by a heavy trapdoor in the corner of the workroom. Darcy didn't open it until the main floor was stable and secure. She descended the steep wooden stairs with her oil lamp held high. The air down here was intensely cold, smelling of wet earth and ancient spider webs. There was a thin layer of standing water near the south wall where the exterior drainage sloped poorly against the foundation. The floor was packed dirt, lined with rough-hewn limestone slabs meant to keep provisions cool. She moved the lantern light over the stones. In the absolute centre of the floor, one large limestone slab bore a deliberate mark. It was a tiny, intricate carving of a saddle-maker's awl crossing a sewing needle, chipped into the rock face. She knelt and traced the groove with her thumb. She knew with immediate certainty that something was buried beneath the stone, but she didn't attempt to pry it up. The time for digging was over. That secret was for the future. On her way back up the wooden stairs, the lantern light caught a shadow in the framing of the floor joists above her head. It was a structural niche, a small gap between the massive timber beams. She reached her hand into the cold space. Her fingers brushed against dry wood. She pulled out a small rectangular oak box, no larger than a deck of cards. She carried it upstairs to the warmth of the stove. The box had a sliding dovetail lid. She pushed it open. Inside lay a heavy brass key, 3 inches long. The bow of the key was forged into the distinct shape of a swivel knife, the heritage craft's primary tool. Beneath the key was a rigid piece of metal. It was a tin-type photograph. The image was grainy with darkened edges, but the subjects were clear. Standing in front of the board and batten exterior of this very building was a young woman holding a leather punch. The woman had Darcy's jawline, Darcy's deep-set eyes, and Darcy's straight posture. She flipped the metal plate over. Etched into the back in a familiar flowing script were the words Eudora Slade, daughter of Jedediah, aged 25, summer of 1903. Darcy looked from the photograph to her own hands, recognizing the same long fingers. She didn't try to find the lock that fit the key. She placed the brass key on the mantel above the wood stove, where it sat untouched for months, a silent promise. The Ozark winter did not surrender quickly, but by mid-March the cold began to retreat from the south-facing slopes. The frozen earth softened, turning the driveway into a thick soup of red clay and gravel. The Buffalo River and the smaller tributary creeks swelled with the spring rain, their voices growing louder as the water rushed over the limestone ledges in the woods surrounding the shop. Life stubbornly pushed through the mat of dead leaves. The magenta blossoms of the redbud trees flared brilliantly against the grey timber, and delicate trout lilies emerged near the water's edge. Darcy stood on the back porch, breathing in the scent of wet soil and growing things. The shop was solid now. It held heat. It shed water. The tools waited in their canvas rolls on the long bench, but she made a conscious decision not to begin the leatherwork this spring. She would not rush the craft. She would learn at a measured pace. She took one of the heavy silver Morgan dollars from the tin box and walked to town, using it to order raw, practice-grade hides from Harlan's catalogue. She would spend the summer practicing the basic cuts, learning how to case the leather with a damp sponge, how to hold the awl without tearing the grain, and how to sharpen the skiving blades on a leather strop. She would start with small things, keychains, simple straps, items that allowed for failure and learning. The legacy of Eudora Slade demanded respect, and respect required time. The saddlery was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in late December of 2026, a hard freeze settled over Newton County. The interior of the saddlery was a haven of warmth and industry. The cast-iron wood stove radiated a steady heat, consuming dry hickory logs Caleb had stacked on the porch. The repaired roof held tight against the sleet. Silent and resolute, the wide pine floors gleamed with a dark honey luster, bearing the fresh marks of heavy boots and the occasional dropped tool. The restored windows held back the biting wind, framing the frozen landscape like clear paintings. On the scarred wooden counter sat Darcy's first fully completed heritage craft product. It was a durable leather field satchel, stitched by hand with waxed linen thread. The edges were burnished to a glass-like finish using saddle soap and canvas, and the front flap was tooled with a subtle, intricate border of oak leaves. It smelled of neat's foot oil, raw leather, and accomplishment. It was an honest piece of work. In the summer of her second year, Darcy had finally resolved the mystery of the brass key. She found a massive dying white oak tree near the property line, with a hollow cavity in its trunk. Bolted deep inside the cavity, hidden from casual view by a curtain of ivy, was a tarnished brass plate with a keyhole. The key from the oak box slid in smoothly. The plate opened a small weatherproof iron cylinder embedded in the heartwood. Inside the cylinder, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a folded 48-star American flag and a brief note written by Eudora Slade. The note was dated August 1898. It read, "For Arthur, the earth holds what the heart cannot." On the 1st of July that year, the anniversary of the Battle of San Juan Hill, Darcy drove to the Fayetteville National Cemetery. She found the veteran marker she had requested from the Historical Society, honoring Arthur Slade. She stood in the manicured grass under the summer sun and buried the bronze campaign medal in the soil at the base of the white headstone. She didn't weep. She simply returned the weight of the metal to the earth. The wealth hidden beneath the floorboards remained largely untouched. Over the 2 years, Darcy had spent exactly 3 coins from the canvas pouch. She used $1 silver to pay off her initial line of credit with Harlan at the hardware store, handing him the antique coin which he accepted with a solemn nod. She used a second silver to buy her practice leather. She used a $10 gold eagle to purchase her first side of premium oak-tanned Herman oak leather to build the satchel. The remaining $400 stayed sealed in the pouch, locked back in the zinc-lined compartment beneath the floorboards. She decided it wasn't her money to spend on groceries or comfort. It was an endowment for the building itself. It was sealed away for the next one, whoever that might be, a century from now. The business had quietly reopened without fanfare or celebration. There was no grand sign facing the county road. Instead, Darcy pinned a small handwritten index card to the corkboard near the cash register at Doris's Diner. Slade Saddlery, leather repair and custom work, County Road 12. The local ranchers and farmers, people with long memories and an appreciation for things built to last, began to find their way up the dirt driveway. By the end of the second year, she had a mailing list of 40 regular patrons who shipped damaged tack and requested custom work. On a Tuesday afternoon, a young man walked into the shop. It was Caleb, taller now. His shoulders broadened by farm work and time. He carried a large flat object wrapped in a burlap sack. He set it on the counter, brushing snow from his jacket. "Made this in wood shop," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. He pulled back the burlap. It was a new wooden sign carved from thick black walnut. The letters were routed deep into the wood and painted with durable white enamel. It read, "Slade and Daughters Custom Saddlery." Darcy looked at the plural word. She ran her hand over the carved letters, feeling the sharp edges of the wood. "There's only me, Caleb." Caleb shrugged, stepping back toward the door and pulling his gloves on. "My mother said there's room for more than one, said a foundation like this ought to look forward." He nodded once and walked out into the cold. That evening, Darcy sat at the workbench under the light of the brass lamp. The tools lay in front of her, cleaned and oiled. She pulled a sheet of heavy cotton paper from a drawer and dipped a steel nib pen into a bottle of dark ink. The wind howled outside, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees, but the interior of the shop was unshakable. She poised the pen over the paper. She thought about the long road of evictions, the cold bus terminals, the silence of her youth. She thought about the smell of beeswax, the heft of the rawhide mall, and the quiet grace of strangers who had held doors open for her. She began to write her own letter, destined for the tin box under the floorboards, for a reader who had not yet been born. She wrote the same opening words Eudora had written a century before. "My dear one, whoever you are, some things are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The Saddlery waits. It has always waited, and 30 miles away, in the quiet, dusty expanse of the Newton County Courthouse, a single $10 bill still sat folded in the back of Martha's desk drawer, the cheapest price ever paid for a life reclaimed.